a debate transpired in Spain in 1550 over the rights to enslave the native peoples in the newly conquered lands, including Mexico, under the encomienda system. Let's better understand this debate with the help of Melvin Bragg and his guest historians on the In Our Time podcast.
In 1550, at royal command, two sides met in Valladolid, in Spain, to debate the future of slavery in the new Spanish colonies in the Americas. One, following Aristotle, argued that native people were natural slaves who went with the land and should stay slaves. The other argued that others might be slaves, but these were Spanish subjects and should be treated as equals. This defender of Native American rights was Bartolomé de las Casas, and some say he was one of the first proponents of human rights anywhere. So they gathered, who are they, in Valladolid in Spain in 1550. What was the purpose of that?
Actually, we need to start the story of the debates at 1547, which is when Juan Inés de Sepúlveda composes this key text, Democrates Alta, also known as Democrates Secundus, at the bequest of the Council of the Indies. And this is petitioning by the likes of Bartolomé de las Casas and others, contesting the legitimacy of the conquest, challenging the violence of the encomenderos. And the Council of the Indies, and also the Crown, wants a kind of tract that asserts the legitimacy and the fact that it's a just war of the Spanish Empire. So this text is composed, but it's not published, it's withheld from publishing, and in fact it's put under investigation. And Sepúlveda, who was a key humanist at the time, very important in Spanish society, was really upset by the withholding of this work from publication. And this kind of dispute between Bartolomé de las Casas and Sepúlveda escalates from 1497.
Let's leave it with these two men, Las Casas and Sepúlveda. Now, Sepúlveda's classicist is translated Aristotle. He believes in Aristotle's idea that they're natural slave. Las Casas says this is terrible, we cannot put up with this, these are human, these are people. And let's use these two as the centre of the debate. So, what's Sepúlveda up to?
The council is called on the 16th of April in 1550 in order to resolve this. And Sepúlveda has effectively argued that the war in Latin America is a just war because the Amerindians can be classed using the Aristotelian category of natural slavery. And he argues that this is because, as he sees it, they're without religion, without custom, laws, without cities, that they have barbaric customs, including the slaughtering of the innocents. And in fact, this can be framed as a just war because, for example, there's a saving of the innocents that could be argued. So it's really about a framing of the just war around this issue.
What he said about them was just plain wrong. He hadn't been there, as you say. Who gave him this false information?
A compilation of sources and reports, and also responding to demands of the encomenderos, who were also describing the Amerindians. And so this was where he was getting his material from for writing this tract, but he's also referring back to how he could fit the category of the Amerindians within pre-existing categories. And in this case, he already has the category of Aristotle's natural slaves, and he thinks about the way this could be imposed upon the Amerindians. So he actually describes them as somewhat lesser than humans, but he accepts that they're humans. But the category of natural slavery is not a fixed state. It's one that you can actually graduate out of with the right kind of stewardship and protection. So he describes them as children to adults and nearly as monkeys to men. Although whether he actually said that or whether that was polemicizing by Las Casas, we're not entirely sure.
Well, let's turn to Las Casas. What did he argue? What was his case?
So Las Casas argued, and he took a long time to argue it. Sepúlveda presented quite a short tract, and Las Casas talked for 5 days. And it's not at all clear whether he said everything he was going to or whether they stopped him after 5 days. But he had an enormous amount of ethnographic information suggesting that these people were civilized and, in his view, very innocent, very open to conversion. He even makes the case that human sacrifice shows how devout they are, that if only you could turn them to Christianity, they would be the most devout people on earth. So he counters the idea that they're uncivilized. But he also is very strongly against the idea that there is any justification for war to impose the faith. As Julia said, there's a big debate here about what a just war is and how one can impose one's beliefs, the method you can do that. He never says that empire is wrong during the debates or that they shouldn't be trying to convert these people and change their beliefs. He believes that it should be done by peaceful means, and he very strongly denounces the abuses of the conquistadors and of the encomenderos as essentially making a proper conversion impossible. How can you bring people to the love of Christ through violence?
And he spoke admiringly of the Amerindians, didn't he?
Very admiringly, although also quite patronizingly. So he sees them as children, as lambs to be led to the knowledge of God. He is very admiring of them, and he also talks admiringly of their institutions. So, for example, law, monarchy, writing, the recording of their histories. There are many missionaries in this period that spend a lot of time recording these indigenous civilizations because they're so sophisticated. So he does speak very admiringly of them, but it is also a very paternalistic viewpoint, the idea that he and his fellow missionaries need to lead them to Christ.
I think it's worth saying that the debates aren't really debates in the format we understand them of cut and thrust, like in Parliament. I think there's a very interesting parallel with what was also going on in Europe in that time, the Council of Trent, that was supposed to be settling the future of the Catholic Church, its doctrine and reform. And the techniques are the same. People present their views. They are
challenged,
usually in back rooms, in the committee meetings behind the scenes. In the formal sessions, everything will be very rigid. One person speaks, sits down, another one gets up. But a judgment is made by a designated group.
Although you don't debate each other, Las Casas did write a response to Sepulveda's points.
Oh, yes.
And Sepulveda was very angry about it because he thought he should have been allowed to do a response as well, but actually only Las Casas does. So
there was a lot of dispute about that kind of procedure. There was in Trent as well, where everyone wanted a full say. But there was this tradition, the Spanish themselves had a tradition, which they'd used with Erasmus a bit earlier, 1527, of having what they would call a committee, in which a group of theologians, in that case, would produce their own opinions. And then the Inquisitor General and the Crown would have a verdict, as it were. It was very much an internal Spanish matter.
If they converted them to Christianity, the implication is that they thought they had a soul to be saved. If they had a soul to be saved, didn't that make them equal to other Christians?
Exactly. And so this text that Las Casas wrote, The Only Way, was in fact influential for Pope Paul III in the bull that he issued also in 1537, Sublimus Deus, which recognised the rationality of the Amerindians, recognising that they had a soul to be saved.
So that plays a part in what is slavery, what is their position, and these phrases came up all the time. Are they monkeys, not men? This is part of it. The soul is part of it.
Exactly, yes. The capacity for human reason in particular.
And yet we're talking about a city bigger than any city in Europe. We're talking about a place with laws, they can do writing, a magnificent place. And still, what was staring them in the face didn't matter one way or another.
The Sepulveda, who puts forward some of these arguments that you've just mentioned, had in fact never visited Latin America, although of course he'd have read different reports from conquistadores. There was knowledge of the Americas in Spain at this time, but he had never himself visited.
What were the new laws of 1542? They're there. Cortes has arrived 23 years earlier, and they're taking over all over the place. There's brutality, people are being forced labour, and so on and so forth. These new laws came in. What were they?
The laws are promulgated by the Spanish Crown in 1542, and they are intended to defend the indigenous people and to improve their rights and their treatment. What's happened is that Las Casas and many other missionaries have been campaigning at court across the early part of the 16th century and saying to the Crown, look at the abuses that are happening. People are publishing, they're writing, they're appearing at court and campaigning essentially on behalf of the indigenous people. And in 1542 they issue these laws which have essentially three central points. There's lots of smaller points, but essentially three central points. To treat the indigenous people better, so there are a number of laws about what they can and can't be used for in terms of their labour, what they should receive in terms of support and well-being, that they cannot under any circumstances be enslaved. And before this point there were justifications for slavery, but at this point they said from henceforth you cannot hold indigenous people as slaves, and if you think you have the right to do so you have to come to Spain and prove your legal title to the indigenous people you hold. And thirdly, they abolished the encomienda effectively by declaring that when encomenderos, holders of encomiendas, died, their encomiendas would revert to the Crown.
How effective were these new laws? How long did they last?
Not very long, because what happens is that the encomenderos, who are the most powerful figures amongst the colonists, are not very happy about this. They've been happily exploiting indigenous labour, forcing people to work for them, and so they're pretty angry about it. The Viceroy of Mexico sees what's happening and thinks, this isn't a very good idea. So he suspends the laws. He applies to the Crown to suspend the laws. He doesn't implement them. And letters and emissaries go back to the Crown saying, this is a terrible idea, we shouldn't do it. The interesting thing, which gets forgotten often, is that the laws remain in effect in Spain. So indigenous people who are in Spain are able to use them to apply for their freedom from enslavement.
But not the millions over in Mexico. So there's pressure on the Spanish Crown. Is it the sense of this Crown versus the Pope here over these new laws?
Not in the usual way, because of course the Spanish Crown regarded itself as the big defender of the papacy and its claims. To understand what's going on, you've not only had in 1492 the conquest of the last bit of Muslim Spain by the Trastamaren dynasty, but then the descent to the Habsburgs of Charles V, who becomes Holy Roman Emperor, hence the fifth, who's first of Spain, and he therefore becomes a defender of Christendom. Great fears that he will be the universal monarch, in other words, a hegemon over all of Europe. Now, the Habsburgs and the papacy clashed very often in Europe. They clashed over how to deal with Martin Luther and the Reformers, and they clashed over other things. So, yes, we can say that by this time, 1542 and onwards with the new laws and then the debates, there was a great deal of tension between the two. So the Habsburgs are actually in quite an awkward position because they've got to deal with their own Spanish subjects and their interests, but they are also trying to sort out the Reformation.
So we are have a clash between the Pope and the Crown.
Yes, and it gets very bad. By the time we get to Pope Paul IV, 1555-9, he wants to excommunicate the Habsburgs.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.